Cold steel locked around Mason Reed's wrists in a busy Chicago hotel lobby, while Amelia Brooks and dozens of stunned employees watched in silence. Two officers believed they had captured a dangerous attacker from the parking garage. Mason did not resist. He simply lowered his head, quietly hiding an old scar behind his collar. But when a senior police captain stepped through the doors and noticed a faded tattoo along his wrist, the captain's expression drained of color instantly. The man standing in handcuffs was no criminal. An entire naval fleet once called him a ghost no one could capture. The Brooks Meridian Hotel rose 38 floors above downtown Chicago, its glass face catching the gray winter light like a blade. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished marble and fresh flowers, and a financial conference of enormous importance was only days away. Amelia Brooks walked through that lobby every morning as though she owned the weight of every tile beneath her heels. Because in every way that mattered, she did. She had inherited the hotel from her father 5 years earlier, and she had spent every one of those years trying to prove she deserved it. Lately, that proof felt harder to find. The hotel had suffered a string of security failures, sloppy reviews, and a persistent rumor that a rival investor wanted to buy the property out from under her. The board of directors had grown impatient, and Amelia knew that if the upcoming conference failed, she would lose more than her reputation. She would lose the only thing her father had ever left her. Mason Reed worked the night shift in the basement levels of that same building, fixing cameras, resetting electronic locks, and occasionally driving guests when the valet staff fell short. He was 34 years old, quiet in a way that made people forget he was in the room, and utterly unremarkable to anyone who did not look closely. He arrived early, stayed late when asked, never argued about pay, and never once raised his voice. Nobody on the management staff thought of him as anything more than a competent pair of hands who kept the building's machinery from falling apart. Amelia herself had passed him in the hallway a dozen times without learning his name, registering him only as the calm, low-ranking technician with eyes that never seemed to blink. What none of them knew was that Mason had once worn a far heavier uniform than the gray polo the hotel issued him. He had served as a Navy SEAL for over a decade, in places the public never heard about, doing work that left no paperwork behind. He had walked away from that life 2 years earlier, not because he had grown weak, but because he had grown tired of funerals. Now his entire world revolved around a small apartment, modest paycheck, and a daughter named Grace who needed a father more than she needed a hero. Every night before his shift ended, Mason called home to check on her, his voice softening into something almost unrecognizable from the discipline he carried on the hotel floor. He never spoke about his service to anyone at work. As far as the Brooks Meridian was concerned, he was simply the quiet man who fixed what broke. Logan Pierce, the head of hotel security, had never liked Mason much, though he could never quite explain why. Perhaps it was the way Mason noticed things other people missed, like blind spots in the parking garage cameras that Logan had conveniently never mentioned to anyone. Perhaps it was simply that Mason made him uneasy in a way he could not name. Logan kept his discomfort hidden behind a professional smile, the kind that fooled everyone except the people paying close enough attention. Amelia trusted him completely, in part because trusting him was easier than questioning the one department holding her crumbling hotel together. On the Tuesday before the conference, with executives and investors due to arrive within the week, Mason noticed something out of place in the VIP parking section. A black delivery truck, unmarked and unscheduled, had been parked in a restricted bay for nearly an hour. He logged it quietly, the way he logged everything, and continued his rounds without raising an alarm. It was a small detail, the kind most people would dismiss as nothing at all. But Mason had spent years learning that the world rarely announced its dangers loudly. It simply waited, parked in plain sight, for someone careless enough to ignore it. 2 days later, Mason was reviewing the parking garage feeds when he saw 3 men he did not recognize entering the restricted technical corridor near the electrical panels. They moved with the kind of practiced ease that told him immediately they were not lost guests or confused vendors. He radioed Logan at once, reporting the intrusion and asking for backup before approaching. Logan's response came back flat and dismissive, telling him to stay out of the VIP wing because Amelia was entertaining a delegation of early investors upstairs and could not afford any disruption. Mason hesitated only a moment before deciding he could not simply ignore 3 strangers near a panel that controlled half the building's locking mechanisms. When he reached the corridor himself, he noticed something else wrong. One of the cameras covering that section had been manually disabled rather than malfunctioning, its small indicator light dark in a way that no software glitch could explain. He moved quietly toward the electrical room, the old instincts returning to his body before his mind had even finished processing the danger. Inside, the three men had pried open a secondary panel and were rigging a device meant to disable the building's lock system and trigger a false fire alarm during the height of the conference. Mason recognized the wiring pattern immediately. It was sabotage, not theft. He tried to avoid a confrontation, calmly telling the men to leave the restricted area before anyone called real security down on them. One of the men turned with a short blade already in his hand, while another circled toward Mason's blind side, clearly expecting an easy target in a hotel uniform. What followed lasted less than 8 seconds. Mason disarmed the man with the blade using a controlled wrist lock, redirected the second attacker into a concrete support beam without breaking anything beyond his pride, and left the third standing frozen, unwilling to test his luck. No real damage was done to anyone, and Mason made sure of that deliberately, even as adrenaline screamed through his blood for the first time in 2 years. What he did not know was that Logan, listening on the radio the entire time, had already placed a call to the police, describing an unprovoked assault on a guest by a hotel employee. A second camera, one Logan controlled the angle of, captured only the moment Mason subdued the men, conveniently missing the blade, missing the wiring, missing every piece of context that mattered. Upstairs, Amelia received word that violence had broken out in her parking garage only minutes before her most important investors were scheduled to tour the property. Her stomach dropped with a fear that had nothing to do with the men involved and everything to do with the fragile reputation she had spent years protecting. Mason gathered the hard drive containing the unaltered footage himself, intending to bring it straight to Amelia before anyone else could shape the story first. He moved quickly through the service corridors, the device tucked under his arm like the only proof of his innocence he would ever need. He had no way of knowing that police cars were already pulling into the front drive, summoned by a man who had every reason to make sure the truth never reached the surface. As Mason stepped into the elevator that would carry him up to the main lobby, he had no idea that the next few minutes would strip away the quiet, unremarkable life he had worked 2 years to build. The elevator climbed slowly, each floor chiming past in a rhythm that felt strangely peaceful compared to what he had just left behind in the garage. He checked the hard drive once more, making sure the housing was secure, running through in his mind exactly how he would explain the wiring and the blade to Amelia without sounding like a man trying to excuse his own actions. He thought briefly of Grace, of the promise he had made himself never to bring violence home with him again, even in memory. For 2 years he had measured his success not in medals or commendations but in ordinary evenings, in homework finished and dinners eaten on time. Whatever happened next, he told himself, he had done nothing wrong down in that garage, and the footage in his hands would prove it the moment someone bothered to look. Officer Hunter Blake strode into the lobby first, young and certain of himself in the way only a handful of years on the force could produce. He spotted Mason near the elevators, still holding the hard drive, and ordered him to drop to his knees in front of dozens of guests and staff who had gathered at the commotion. Mason calmly explained that he had evidence in his hands proving exactly what had happened in the garage, but Hunter barely registered the words. Logan had already reached the officers minutes earlier, painting a picture of an unstable employee with a history of unauthorized access to restricted areas, and that story had arrived first, which meant it arrived loudest. Amelia emerged from the conference room just as the scene reached its peak, her makeup still fresh from greeting investors, her schedule still running on the assumption that today would be the day her hotel finally turned a corner. Instead, she found Mason kneeling near the elevators, his uniform dusted with garage grime, his expression unreadable in a way that struck her as cold rather than composed. Logan stepped beside her immediately, voice heavy with manufactured disappointment, claiming Mason had a temper problem and had been caught sneaking into camera rooms before. Amelia, exhausted and frightened for everything she had built, chose in that moment to believe the story that required the least imagination. Mason did not raise his voice or fight the narrative forming around him. He simply looked at Amelia and told her, quietly enough that only she and the nearest officers could hear, that she needed to review the hard drive before signing anything that night. To Amelia's ears, shaped by fear and exhaustion, the sentence landed as a threat rather than a warning. She gave the order to cooperate fully with police and suspend Mason from his duties effective immediately, the words leaving her mouth before she had time to consider any version of events beyond the one already in front of her. Hunter clicked the handcuffs shut around Mason's wrists right there in the lobby, the metallic sound carrying further than it should have in a room built for marble silence. Several employees turned away rather than watch, while others whispered to one another that they had always sensed something unsettling about the quiet man from maintenance. Mason lowered his head, not from shame over anything he had done, but from the particular ache of being judged before anyone had asked him a single real question. He had survived ambushes in places with no names on any map, yet nothing had prepared him for the simple, public humiliation of being condemned by people who had never bothered to look past his uniform. As the officers led him toward the doors, Mason caught sight of a man standing near the edge of the lobby, watching with the faint, satisfied smile of someone whose plan was unfolding exactly as designed. Jason Cross adjusted his cufflinks and said nothing, content to let the chaos do the work he had paid handsomely to set in motion. Mason filed the man's face away with the same precision he once reserved for targets in briefing rooms half a world away, though he said nothing about it then. Just before he was guided through the revolving doors, Mason turned his head slightly toward Amelia one final time. In a voice too calm for the situation, he told her that if the locking system on the 38th floor failed within the next hour, she should not trust the man standing beside her. Amelia opened her mouth to respond, but the doors had already swallowed him into the gray afternoon light, leaving her standing in a lobby gone suddenly, uncomfortably silent. The interrogation room at the precinct smelled of stale coffee and old paint, a fluorescent light humming overhead in a way that would have unsettled most people after the day Mason had endured. Hunter sat across from him, still convinced he was looking at a disgruntled employee who had finally snapped under pressure and wanted attention from his employer. Mason asked for only one thing, calmly and without repeating himself twice, that someone review the hard drive he had carried out of the garage before any charges moved forward. Hunter assumed the request was a stalling tactic, the kind of thing guilty men invented when they ran out of better excuses, and he leaned into a series of sharp accusatory questions meant to provoke a reaction. Mason gave him none. His breathing stayed even, his shoulders relaxed in the particular way of someone who had once been trained to remain still under conditions far worse than a poorly lit room and an impatient young officer. It was a stillness that unsettled Hunter more than any outburst could have, though he could not have explained why if asked. Captain Carter Hayes arrived not long after, summoned by a brief report that had crossed his desk almost by accident. He had served in the Navy himself decades earlier, long before trading one uniform for another, and something about the case file nagged at him in a way paperwork rarely did. He stepped into the room intending only a routine check, his manner brisk and professional, until his eyes settled on the faint scar curling behind Mason's collar and the edge of a weathered tattoo just visible beneath his rolled sleeve. Carter asked a question that had nothing to do with the garage, the hotel, or anything in the official report. He spoke a single old call sign, a designation from a campaign that had never appeared in any newspaper, watching closely for a reaction. Mason went silent for several long seconds before answering with a short, precise phrase that confirmed everything Carter needed to know. The temperature in the room seemed to shift entirely. Carter ordered the handcuffs removed at once, though Mason quietly asked that they remain in place until the footage had been reviewed properly, unwilling to let his own comfort interfere with the process of clearing his name through evidence rather than reputation. Hunter watched the exchange with growing confusion, unable to understand why his captain's entire posture had changed in the space of a single sentence he hadn't understood. Carter pulled aside the department's records and confirmed within minutes what his instincts had already told him. Mason Reed was a retired Navy SEAL, a man who had spent more than a decade participating in operations too sensitive to ever appear in any public account, including hostage rescues that had quietly saved lives no headline ever credited him for. Mason offered no embellishment when Carter asked him gently about his service. He said only that he did not wish to discuss the past, that he was simply a father trying to hold together an ordinary life after years of carrying an extraordinary one. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a tired kind of honesty that made the claim impossible to doubt. Before Carter could say anything further, his phone rang with an urgent call from the Brooks Meridian, a panicked voice reporting that the locking system on the 38th floor had failed exactly as Mason had warned less than an hour earlier. Carter looked across the table at Mason, who had not moved, had not gloated, had not even raised an eyebrow at being proven right so quickly. There was something almost unsettling about a man who could predict disaster with that kind of precision and still sit calmly waiting for the world to catch up to him. Hunter finally found his voice. asking quietly whether they should release him immediately given the new information. Carter nodded once, already reaching for his jacket, already understanding that the night ahead would require far more than a routine report and a closed file. Back at the Brooks Meridian, the conference floor had descended into quiet chaos. The 38th floor sat locked from the inside, elevators stuttered between levels without warning, and a false fire alarm shrieked through the hallways at the worst possible moment, just as the most important investors of the year began wondering whether they had chosen the wrong hotel for their business. Amelia stood in the security office watching the cascading failures on a bank of monitors, Mason's final words replaying in her mind with an insistence she could no longer dismiss as coincidence. She turned toward Logan, intending to ask for an explanation, and noticed for the first time how carefully he avoided meeting her eyes. He spoke quickly, suggesting that Mason likely had accomplices working from outside, perhaps even orchestrating this very failure as revenge for his suspension. The explanation, which might have satisfied her only hours earlier, now sounded thin and rehearsed in a way she could not ignore. Amelia demanded full access to the original camera footage from earlier in the day, only to discover that several crucial segments had already been deleted from the primary servers. A young technician, nervous and unwilling to be blamed for the gap, admitted that only Mason had ever set up a secondary backup system months earlier, precisely because he had not trusted the primary servers to remain secure under pressure. Amelia felt something cold settle in her stomach as the technician pulled up the backup files that existed only because a man she had just had arrested had quietly prepared for exactly this kind of failure. Shame arrived before clarity did. Amelia thought of Mason kneeling in her lobby, of the calm, almost gentle warning he had given her on his way out the door, and she realized with sickening certainty that she had dismissed the one person who had been trying to protect her hotel from the very beginning. She called Carter directly, her voice tighter than she intended, demanding to know where Mason had been taken and whether he was being treated fairly. Carter's tone on the other end of the line was measured but pointed. He told her that Mason was not the man she believed him to be, though he stopped short of revealing details that remained sealed under decades of military confidentiality. Something in his restraint told Amelia that whatever truth she was missing ran far deeper than a simple misunderstanding about a parking garage altercation. She left the hotel within minutes, abandoning a conference floor still in disarray to drive across the city herself. At the precinct, she found Mason seated calmly, the red marks of the handcuffs still visible along his wrists, his posture as composed as it had been hours earlier in her lobby. She tried to offer an apology, the words tumbling out faster than she had planned, but Mason simply told her that her hotel was still in danger and that apologies could wait until the danger had passed. Before she could respond, Carter pulled her aside and told her something that reshaped everything she thought she understood about the quiet maintenance technician she had ordered arrested that afternoon. Mason Reed, he explained, was the kind of man governments called when every other option had already failed. Amelia stood in the hallway outside the interrogation room for a long moment after Carter walked away, trying to reconcile the image of the silent technician who fixed her cameras with whatever lay behind that single sentence. She thought back over every interaction she had ever had with Mason, searching for clues she had been too distracted to notice, and found only a man who had never once asked for recognition, never once raised his voice, never once given her any reason to suspect there was more beneath the surface than a steady, careful employee doing his job. The realization that she had built an entire judgment of his character on nothing more than his job title left her unsettled in a way she had not expected. Carter returned to the interrogation room with a thin folder, the minimal portion of Mason's record he was permitted to share under the rules that still governed such things years after a man's service ended. It confirmed that Mason Reed had belonged to an elite Navy SEAL unit, deployed on operations involving hostage rescues in international waters, missions so sensitive that most of the official paperwork remained classified even from local police departments. Hunter, standing near the doorway, felt his stomach drop as he realized the man he had marched through a crowded hotel lobby in handcuffs was someone trained at a level few people in that building could even imagine. Mason did not preen under the revelation. If anything, he seemed faintly embarrassed by the attention, his voice flat as he told Carter that none of those old titles helped him pay rent or gave his daughter a more peaceful father at the end of the day. Amelia, listening from a chair near the wall, found herself struck by the plainness of the statement. She had spent her entire career surrounded by men who treated power as currency to be spent loudly and often, and here was a man who had access to more legitimate power than any of them, choosing instead to spend his days fixing broken cameras and locks. Carter asked, almost gently, why Mason had not fought back when the officers first arrived at the hotel, given that physically overpowering two officers would have presented him little difficulty. Mason answered that resisting would only have made things worse, not just for himself, but for the officers doing their jobs and for the hotel already teetering on the edge of crisis. Hunter lowered his eyes at that, the shame of his earlier certainty settling heavily over him as he understood, perhaps for the first time, that the man he had handcuffed had chosen restraint not out of weakness but out of a deeper, harder discipline. The hard drive was finally connected and reviewed in full. The unedited footage showed exactly what Mason had described from the beginning: 3 unidentified men prying open an electrical panel, one of them drawing a blade, Mason intervening only enough to stop the sabotage without escalating the violence himself. A second clip, buried earlier in the timeline, showed something none of them had expected. Logan Pierce, standing near the same restricted corridor hours before the incident, speaking quietly with the same 3 men before they ever touched the panel. Amelia felt the floor tilt beneath her. The man she had trusted with her hotel's entire security operation had been working against her from the inside, while the man she had ordered arrested in front of her own staff had been the only one trying to stop the damage before it spread. Carter's expression hardened as he reviewed the footage a second time, recognizing immediately that this was no longer a simple matter of an employee dispute, but something closer to a deliberate, coordinated attack on a business. He ordered an official task force assembled within the hour, pulling in additional officers and notifying hotel corporate security of the scale of what they were now facing. Mason agreed to return to the hotel and assist, though he set one condition before standing up from his chair. Amelia would need to listen to him fully for the next 3 hours, without interruption and without doubt, regardless of how unconventional his instructions might sound. Amelia agreed without hesitation, a small but significant shift from the woman who had ordered his arrest only hours earlier on the strength of a single hurried report. She watched him rise from the chair, the same quiet man she had walked past in hallways a dozen times, and found it strange how completely her perception of him had reversed in the space of a single evening. Hunter offered to drive them both back to the hotel personally, an unspoken apology folded into the gesture, and Carter followed close behind, already issuing instructions over his radio to secure the building's remaining access points before anyone else could exploit them. They returned through a service entrance rather than the main doors, an arrangement Mason suggested himself to avoid sending the remaining guests into further panic at the sight of police vehicles parked along the front drive. Inside the cramped service corridor, Mason laid out his read of the situation with the same calm precision he had used in the interrogation room. This was never about stealing money, he explained, but about manufacturing a crisis large enough to collapse Amelia's standing with her investors and force her into selling the hotel at a fraction of its true value. Amelia connected the pieces almost immediately. Jason Cross had approached her twice in the past year about acquiring the property, each offer lower than the last, each rejection met with a politeness that now felt calculated rather than gracious. Mason instructed her to revoke Logan's access credentials at once, only to learn through a quick radio check that Logan had already vanished from the security office, his badge left behind on the desk like an afterthought. Working from memory and instinct rather than any official map, Mason began reconstructing the saboteur's likely path through the building, drawing on patterns of access points and blind spots he had cataloged in his head over months of quiet observation. Hunter, no longer questioning every word out of habit, began following his directions without hesitation, falling naturally into the rhythm of a man used to taking orders from someone who clearly knew the terrain better than anyone else in the room. The most urgent discovery came moments later. The 38th floor was not simply locked. 3 of the hotel's most important investors remained trapped inside a conference suite, their phones rendered useless by a jamming device hidden somewhere nearby, their voices muffled behind doors that refused every manual override attempt. Amelia's breathing turned shallow at the thought of any harm coming to them under her roof, her mind already racing toward headlines and lawsuits and the swift, total collapse of everything she had spent years building. Mason's voice dropped lower, steady in a way that cut directly through her rising panic. He told her to focus only on the facts in front of them rather than the fear trying to consume her thinking, a simple instruction that nonetheless settled something in her chest almost immediately. It was the first moment Amelia witnessed the full shape of his leadership, not loud, not aggressive, but a quiet, total command of every variable in the room that no title or boardroom seat could ever fully replicate. As they moved deeper into the building's lower levels, Mason caught sight of a maintenance camera feed showing Logan guiding a second man, well-dressed and unmistakably out of place among the service corridors, directly toward the hotel's primary server room. Mason recognized the second man's posture instantly from the lobby earlier that day. It was Jason Cross, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who believed the game was already won, heading straight for the one room capable of erasing every piece of evidence against him. Mason studied the feed a second longer than necessary, memorizing the route they had taken and the timing of the corridor lights along the way, the same habit of mind that had once kept entire teams alive in places far more hostile than a hotel basement. Carter arrived at his side just as the image cut to static, the jamming device apparently strong enough to interfere with even the internal monitoring system now. Amelia watched the two men exchange a brief, wordless glance, a silent agreement passing between them that needed no further explanation. Whatever came next would have to happen quickly, before Jason Cross and Logan finished what they had started and walked away clean, leaving Amelia to answer for a catastrophe she had never actually caused. Amelia insisted on going with Mason toward the server room, but Carter urged her to remain in a secured area until the situation had been contained properly. Mason overruled neither of them directly, instead telling Amelia plainly that she had every right to see for herself who was destroying her company, provided she followed his instructions exactly once they moved. Carter relented, recognizing that arguing further would only cost them time they could not afford to lose. They moved together through a dim service hallway, the distant wail of alarms bleeding through concrete walls in a way that gave the entire building a tense, cinematic hush. Amelia found herself asking, almost involuntarily, why a man with his background had chosen a job fixing cameras and driving guests rather than something that matched the scale of what he had once done. Mason answered without hesitation, telling her that he had already seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, and that all he wanted now was a steady job, a small apartment, and an ordinary schedule built around raising his daughter in peace. Amelia absorbed the answer in silence for several steps, turning over the realization that she had spent years measuring people by job titles, income, and polish, never once considering that the quietest person in any room might be carrying the heaviest history. It was an uncomfortable thought, but not an unwelcome one, and she found herself looking at Mason differently with every step they took deeper into the building. He paused near a junction box hidden behind a maintenance panel and located a small jamming device wired crudely into the system, exactly the kind of improvised hardware someone without his training might never have noticed at all. With a few precise movements, he disabled it, restoring partial signal to the floors above and allowing the trapped investors on the 38th floor to finally reach the outside world. Their voices, when they came through, were tight with fear, demanding answers about doors that still refused to open despite the restored connection. Before Mason could explain further, Logan's voice crackled over the internal speaker system, calm and almost amused, threatening to release a doctored video clip portraying Mason as a violent aggressor unless Amelia agreed to sign over the hotel to Jason Cross by morning. Amelia's hands curled into fists at her sides, fury rising in a way she rarely allowed herself to show in public. Mason placed a steady hand near her shoulder, not quite touching her, just enough presence to anchor her attention back toward the moment instead of the rage trying to consume it. He told her quietly that arguing with someone trying to provoke her into losing control would only hand them exactly what they wanted. Amelia exhaled slowly, forcing the fury down into something colder and far more useful. Mason then made a quick decision, splitting their group so that Carter and Hunter could move toward the 38th floor to free the trapped investors, while he and Amelia continued on toward the server room to confront Logan and Jason Cross directly before either man could finish erasing the truth. Carter hesitated only briefly before agreeing to the plan, recognizing that Mason's read of the building's layout and the saboteur's likely movements had already proven correct at every turn that night. Hunter checked his weapon and his radio one final time, the nervous energy of earlier hours replaced now by a steadier kind of focus, the look of a young officer finally trusting the instincts of someone who had clearly done this kind of work before. As the two groups separated at the junction, Amelia glanced once more at Mason, searching his face for any sign of the fear she still felt pressing against her own ribs, and found instead the same unreadable calm that had first struck her as coldness back in the lobby. She understood now that it had never been coldness at all. It was simply a man who had long ago learned how to function steadily inside chaos that would have broken almost anyone else. The server room hummed with the low electric whine of cooling fans, red emergency lighting washing the narrow space in a tense flickering glow that made every shadow look like it might move on its own. Logan stood hunched over a terminal, copying files onto a portable drive, while Jason Cross stood behind Amelia's empty chair near the door, a tablet in hand displaying a transfer agreement waiting only for her signature. Jason's voice carried the relaxed cruelty of a man who believed he had already won, telling Amelia that signing now would end the crisis quietly, sparing her the embarrassment of watching her hotel collapse in front of every camera in the city. He turned toward Mason next, his smile sharpening into something closer to contempt, reminding him that a man who had spent the afternoon in handcuffs held no place in a conversation among people who actually mattered. Mason said nothing in response to the insult. He simply set the original hard drive down on the nearest console and told Jason, in a voice utterly without anger, that every game built on lies eventually ends the moment the truth finds a copy of itself. Logan lunged first, swinging a stun baton toward Mason's ribs with more desperation than skill. Mason shifted half a step, caught the wrist behind the weapon, twisted it free, and guided Logan backward into a chair hard enough to end the fight without breaking a single bone. Two of Jason's hired men rushed in from the corridor behind him, clearly expecting an easy advantage against a single opponent. Mason's met them with the same economy of motion he had used in the garage 2 days earlier, each strike measured precisely enough to end the threat without becoming the kind of violence he had spent 2 years trying to leave behind. Amelia watched the entire sequence unfold in stunned silence, recognizing for the first time just how dangerous Mason truly could be, and understanding in the same breath that his restraint was the far more remarkable thing to witness. Jason, his composure finally cracking, grabbed Amelia's arm and began dragging her toward a side exit, hoping to use her as leverage against the chaos closing in around him. Mason did not charge in recklessly. Instead, he spoke directly to Jason, his voice low and deliberately distracting, drawing the man's attention away from his grip just long enough for Amelia to wrench her arm free and step clear of his reach. Carter and Hunter burst through the main door seconds later, having the trapped out investors upstairs, and followed the sound of the struggle down through the building. Hunter moved with calm, practiced precision this time, securing Jason Cross without hesitation or unnecessary force, the lessons of the day fully absorbed into his bearing. Mason handed over the original footage to Carter without ceremony, along with an audio recording capturing Logan's earlier conversation with the saboteurs near the parking garage panel, evidence enough to dismantle every lie that had been told about him since the previous afternoon. As officers led Logan and Jason out under full restraint, Hunter reached into his evidence bag and withdrew the same set of handcuffs he had used in the lobby that afternoon. He set them quietly on a nearby console, looked directly at Mason, and offered a formal apology in front of everyone still standing in the room, acknowledging plainly that he had judged a man's character before ever bothering to learn the truth about him. Mason accepted the apology with a slow nod, no trace of triumph in his expression, only a kind of weary relief that the night had finally reached its end without anyone being seriously hurt. Carter clapped a hand briefly on his shoulder, the gesture of one veteran acknowledging another across the gap of different uniforms and different wars. Amelia stood a few steps back, watching the room slowly empty of officers and restrained men, the hum of the servers the only sound left once the shouting had faded. She looked at the handcuffs sitting on the console, then at Mason, and felt the full weight of how close she had come to letting fear and assumption cost her the one person who had been trying to save everything she cared about from the very beginning. Jason Cross and Logan Pierce were formally charged within days, facing counts of corporate sabotage, extortion, defamation, and reckless endangerment of hotel guests. The financial conference, which had seemed doomed only hours earlier, recovered faster than anyone expected. Several investors had considered withdrawing entirely after witnessing the chaos firsthand, but the transparent way Amelia handled the crisis once the truth surfaced convinced most of them to stay and finalize their commitments, rather than walk away from a hotel that had proven it could survive a genuine attack with its integrity intact. Carter personally filed the official report confirming that Mason had acted strictly in self-defense and in direct prevention of criminal sabotage, closing the door on any lingering question about his conduct in the garage or anywhere else that night. Hunter sought Mason out again the following afternoon, this time with none of the bravado from their first encounter, admitting openly that he had allowed a hurried report and his own assumptions to his judgment of a man he had never actually spoken to before that day. Mason did not use the moment to make Hunter feel smaller than he already did. He told him simply that a good officer was not someone who never made mistakes, but someone willing to correct them before the damage became permanent. Amelia called a brief meeting with her full staff 2 days later, gathering everyone in the same lobby where the handcuffs had first closed around Mason's wrists. Standing in front of her employees, she admitted plainly that she had failed to listen to a man who deserved better, that she had let fear and assumption override her judgment, and that an innocent person had been publicly humiliated in her hotel because of decisions she herself had made too quickly. There was no attempt to soften the admission or shift blame elsewhere. She simply stated what had happened and what she intended to do differently going forward. She then offered Mason a new position overseeing crisis security operations for the entire property, along with a salary that reflected both his skill and the trust she now placed in him completely. Mason did not answer immediately. He told her honestly that he had never been interested in chasing power or title, but that he would accept the role if it meant the hotel would no longer be run on convenient assumptions and quiet fear, choosing instead to make decisions grounded in truth even when truth proved inconvenient. Amelia watched him walk out of the meeting room a few minutes later, the same unremarkable gray uniform on his shoulders, the same quiet, unhurried stride she had passed a dozen times without truly seeing him. Except now, for the first time, she understood exactly who had been walking past her all along. He was not simply an employee who had been wrongly accused. He was the man who had saved not only her hotel, but the integrity of every decision she would ever make as the person responsible for it. In the days that followed, word of the failed sabotage spread quietly through the upper levels of Chicago's business community, though Amelia made certain none of it ever turned into a spectacle surrounding Mason personally. She understood, without needing him to say so directly, that he had no interest in becoming a story told at dinner parties or repeated in boardrooms for sympathy or admiration. The hotel's reputation recovered on the strength of how the crisis had been resolved, not on the mystery of who had resolved it, and that distinction mattered greatly to the man who had spent 2 years building a life specifically designed to avoid attention of any kind. A few weeks later, the Brooks Meridian had fully recovered its standing in the city, its name mentioned in business circles as an example of a company that had survived a deliberate attack rather than collapsed under one. Reporters occasionally circled the story, eager for a dramatic angle about the quiet hero behind the scenes, but Amelia made certain Mason was never turned into a headline or a marketing tool for the hotel's recovery. He continued his work much as before, though every employee who passed him in the hallway now did so with a quiet, genuine respect that had nothing to do with fear or curiosity. One evening, Amelia found him on the rooftop terrace after a long shift, the city skyline glowing faintly behind them in the cooling night air. She thanked him again, this time without the urgency of crisis pressing against her words, telling him plainly that he had taught her something no business degree or boardroom experience ever had, that a person's worth could never truly be measured by their title or their paycheck. Mason listened quietly before answering that he too had needed time to learn something similar after leaving the service, that the hardest battle was rarely the one fought with weapons, but the quiet daily struggle of believing he deserved a peaceful life after everything the past had cost him. Amelia did not push him to open up further than he was ready for. She simply offered to work alongside him in rebuilding the hotel's security operations with more honesty and less fear than the system Logan had left behind. Months earlier, Mason had been led out of that very lobby in handcuffs, treated as a danger by the very people he had been quietly protecting all along. Now, standing on the rooftop in the calm Chicago evening, he finally stood in the one place that had once stripped him of his dignity, seen at last for exactly who he truly was. If you really want to know why the police had to apologize to him, stay until the very last second.